Do you travel with a phone in your pocket? Chances are you are generating information about your travel patterns and reporting this to some entity that is interested in your data. In fact, I am interested in your data. I am a transport engineering researcher, and every day I use traffic data that is reported by moving vehicles, which we call floating car data. Floating car data is available anywhere on the road network without needing expensive roadside sensor infrastructure or communication systems. And so many researchers have suggested that floating car data is particularly useful in the low and middle income country context. But is floating car data the silver bullet for transport data in the African context? I am Megan from the Department of Civil Engineering at Stellenbosch University.
And I'm Roger from the Department of Civil Engineering and the Faculty of Engineering and the Built Environment at UCT. Together, we've been looking at the context in which traffic data in Africa is collected to determine how appropriate floating car data is for transport planning in our specific context.
Floating car data are reported by mobile sensors, providing trip information such as speed and routing along the trajectories of vehicles that carry smartphones and GPS navigation devices. Commercial floating car data can be purchased from third-party data companies in easily usable formats for transport planning applications and is also completely anonymous, protecting the information of users. So what could be the problem here? Floating car data are easily accessible, available almost everywhere, and are anonymous. But floating car data are only reported by a sample of travellers, and in Africa, that sample is not likely to be free of socioeconomic and demographic bias.
Literature shows that the application of floating car data is somewhat limited in Africa. Most FCD-type studies use privately developed floating car data systems, collecting trip data from smartphone apps carried by field workers on specific modes of transport. This type of data has been used extensively in Africa to study informal public transport services, also known as paratransit. Importantly, though, not much research is being conducted using commercial floating car data, and African-based floating car data research is not keeping up with other countries that study aspects of accuracy and validity of these data.
So, what aspects will impact floating car data accuracy in Africa? In the absence of floating car data-based studies in Africa, we turn to several studies which mapped how malaria, Ebola, and more recently COVID-19 spread across the continent using mobile phone data. These studies reported that mobile data are susceptible to biases because mobile phone ownership varies according to age, gender, and income level in Africa. Also, wealthier people tend to make more trips, intensifying data bias. Bias is further compounded by phone usage behaviours common in Africa, such as phone sharing or having more than one phone because of high call rates between service providers. The sample bias that will impact mobile phone data will likely be exacerbated in smartphone GPS reported floating car data. In 2021, 55% of the lowest income quintile in Africa had access to a mobile phone, but only 7% of the same group owned a smartphone.
At the same time, we also looked at how low and middle income country land use planning and transport systems might impact floating car data accuracy. In many African countries, the urban poor live on the outskirts of cities in sprawling informal settlements that spring up to accommodate rapid urbanization. Fringe informal settlements and the dominant city centres typical of low and middle income countries result in what's known as spatial mismatch, where the poorest communities are placed furthest from work and social opportunities. Dominant city centres also lead to severe congestion, worsened by radial arterial networks, which funnel trips through the busy city centres.
So, socioeconomic and demographic factors will impact floating car data, while travel patterns are also impacted by population distributed according to socioeconomic status and an urban environment that results in spatial mismatch and congestion. If we are to use floating car data in this environment, we have to understand how floating car data is impacted by this contextual situation. But as Roger said, no research has considered if and how floating car data is impacted by urban form and socioeconomic biases in Africa. Our recent research paper has considered how floating car data application is impacted by these factors. We also make suggestions for a research agenda that will guide appropriate research for floating car data application in Africa. commercial floating car data is going to become a significant source of traffic data. In fact, floating car data is likely to be the only viable option to produce traffic data over the extensive road network of Africa because of its coverage, limited infrastructure requirements, and continuous reporting. We need to work to understand the correct application of floating car data and the biases that can impact this data source.